The Victoria Hall disaster unfolded on the afternoon of June 16, 1883, in the industrial town of Sunderland in northeast England, a place shaped by shipyards, coal dust and tightly packed working-class neighborhoods where leisure for children was scarce and treasured. Victoria Hall stood as a proud civic building on Tord Road, constructed only a few years earlier and named in honor of Queen Victoria, symbolizing progress, respectability and moral improvement through public entertainment. That Saturday, the hall was hosting a children's variety show organized by local promoters, featuring conjurers, clowns, singers and novelty acts, with the promise that every child attending would receive a free toy at the end of the performance. In an era when toys were luxuries and families lived hand-to-mouth, the announcement alone was enough to ensure an overwhelming turnout. By early afternoon, thousands of children, many unaccompanied by adults, streamed through the doors of Victoria Hall, their excitement echoing through the corridors as they packed into the seating areas, filling the galleries and aisles with restless energy. The show itself passed in laughter and noise, but beneath the surface of cheer lay the fatal conditions that would soon turn joy into catastrophe. Inadequate crowd control, poor understanding of child behavior in emergencies, and most critically, exit doors designed with narrow openings and inward-opening mechanisms that would become deadly choke points. As the performance neared its conclusion, anticipation intensified among the children, not for the final act but for the toys promised at the end. The organizers, either carelessly or with misplaced optimism, decided to distribute the toys at the foot of the staircase leading down to the ground floor exit, rather than dispersing them evenly or delaying distribution until the hall was cleared. This single decision became the spark that ignited the disaster. As the curtain fell and word spread that toys were being handed out, a surge of children rose simultaneously and rushed toward the stairway. The staircase itself was steep and narrow, descending into a short corridor that led to a set of double doors opening inward, with only one side partially unlocked. The crowd at the top of the stairs pushed forward with mounting pressure, unaware of the bottleneck below, while those at the bottom slowed or stopped as they reached the closed or partially closed door. Children began to stumble, some falling on the steps, others tripping over them, and within seconds bodies piled up in a tangled mass, compressing those beneath with crushing force. The children at the rear, unable to see what was happening ahead, continued to push forward, driven by excitement rather than malice, and the pressure increased exponentially, turning the staircase into a deadly funnel of panic and suffocation. The physics of crowd movement became merciless. Small bodies were forced together so tightly that many could no longer expand their chests to breathe. Some were pinned against walls and banisters, others trapped face down beneath the weight of dozens of children, their cries muffled and then silenced. The inward opening door at the bottom, pressed by the mass of bodies, could not be opened, effectively sealing the exit and transforming it into a wall against which the children were crushed. Within minutes, the staircase became a scene of unimaginable horror. Those who survived later described the sensation of being lifted off their feet, unable to control their own movements, their arms pinned, their lungs burning for air. The sounds shifted from laughter to screaming to an eerie, choking silence as oxygen disappeared and panic exhausted itself into stillness. When attendants and adults finally realized something was wrong and forced their way into the stairwell, they were confronted with a solid mass of bodies packed so tightly that it took time even to recognize where one child ended and another began. Rescue efforts were chaotic and heartbreaking. Adults pulled children free one by one, some limp and unresponsive, others gasping weakly as fresh air reached their lungs. The corridor and stairwell filled with the sounds of desperate attempts at resuscitation, with rescuers performing rudimentary life-saving measures known at the time, laying children on the ground, loosening clothing and trying to stimulate breathing. Horse-drawn carts were commandeered to transport the injured to nearby homes and hospitals, while bodies of those who had died were carried out and laid in rows, their small shoes and rumpled clothes bearing silent witness to the scale of the tragedy. In total, 183 children lost their lives, most between the ages of 3 and 14, making it one of the deadliest crowd disasters involving children in British history. The town of Sunderland was plunged into shock and grief almost immediately, as parents searched frantically for sons and daughters who would never return home. The aftermath spread sorrow through every corner of the community. Funerals followed one after another, sometimes dozens in a single day, as families buried children who had gone out for an afternoon of entertainment and never came back. Streets were lined with mourners, black crepe hung from doors and windows, and churches overflowed with grieving parents and siblings. The emotional weight of the disaster was so immense that it drew national attention, with newspapers across Britain publishing detailed accounts that horrified readers and raised urgent questions about public safety. An official inquiry was convened to determine responsibility, and while it stopped short of assigning criminal blame, it exposed severe failures in building design, event organization, and crowd management. Investigators concluded that the inward opening doors were a critical factor, as they could not be opened against the pressure of a crowd, and that the placement of toy distribution at the exit directly encouraged the deadly rush. Public outrage following the inquiry became a catalyst for change. The Victoria Hall disaster forced authorities, architects, and lawmakers to confront a truth that had been ignored for too long. Buildings designed for public assembly could become lethal traps if exits were not designed with emergency evacuation in mind. As a direct result, regulations were introduced requiring that doors in public buildings open outward and be fitted with panic bars or latches that could be easily opened under pressure. These changes, simple in concept but profound in impact, saved countless lives in the decades that followed and became standard practice around the world. The tragedy at Victoria Hall thus reshaped building safety standards, embedding the hard-learned lessons of Sunderland into the fabric of modern architecture and public safety planning. Yet beyond regulations and reforms, the disaster left an enduring emotional scar so deep that it reshaped the collective memory of Sunderland and lingered long after the physical wounds had healed. The deaths of 183 children were not absorbed as a distant statistic but felt as a personal loss in nearly every street, every workplace, every church pew. Entire neighborhoods were bound together by shared mourning, because the victims came largely from working-class families whose lives were already marked by hardship and fragility. Parents who had sent their children out for an afternoon of innocent amusement were left with an unfillable silence in their homes, rooms still holding toys, shoes, and half-finished chores that would never again be touched by small hands. The sound of children playing in the streets seemed, for a time, almost unbearable, a reminder of what had been taken. Grief did not fade quickly. It settled into the town like a permanent shadow, shaping how people spoke, gathered, and remembered. Memorials were erected not merely as markers of death, but as collective acts of remembrance and penance. Public subscriptions were raised so that even the poorest families could see their children honored, and monuments were designed with solemn care, inscribed with names that transformed an overwhelming number into individual lives, each with a story abruptly ended. Annual memorial services became rituals of remembrance, attended by survivors who carried lifelong memories of the crush, by parents who never fully recovered from the loss, and by townspeople who understood that the tragedy belonged to all of them. These commemorations were not quiet formalities. They were emotionally charged moments in which grief was renewed, shared, and slowly woven into the identity of the community itself. The story of the Victoria Hall disaster was passed down through generations as a warning written in grief rather than ink. Children grew up hearing about it from parents and grandparents, not as a distant historical curiosity, but as a lesson about carelessness, responsibility, and the unseen dangers that can hide behind festive promises. The disaster entered local folklore as a moral reckoning, a reminder that excitement can blind judgment and that authority figures carry immense responsibility when dealing with crowds, especially those made up of the young and vulnerable. It was remembered not because of malice or evil intent, but precisely because it arose from ordinary decisions made without foresight, decisions that seemed harmless until their consequences became irreversible. The Victoria Hall disaster stands as a stark reminder that tragedy does not always announce itself with warning signs or dramatic villainy. Often, it emerges quietly from design flaws accepted as normal, from organizational shortcuts justified by convenience, and from an underestimation of how human beings behave under pressure. In this case, the vulnerability of children magnified every mistake. Their small size, limited strength, and instinctive rush toward reward transformed a poorly designed stairwell and door into a lethal trap. The disaster revealed how crowds can behave like physical forces, how excitement can turn into compression, and how panic can arise not from fear but from anticipation. These lessons, painfully learned, would echo far beyond Sunderland. It remains a defining example of how joy can turn to catastrophe in moments, and how the price of safety regulations is sometimes paid in innocent lives long before the rules exist. The outward opening doors and panic mechanisms that later became standard were not abstract improvements. They were direct responses to crushed bodies, suffocated lungs, and unanswered cries on a staircase in 1883. Every public building made safer in the decades that followed carried, invisibly, the legacy of those children. Their deaths became part of the foundation upon which modern crowd safety was built, a grim but enduring contribution to the protection of future generations. Long after the hall itself faded from prominence and the world moved on to new tragedies and new reforms, the echo of that afternoon continued to shape how societies think about responsibility, design, and moral accountability. Architects learned to see exits not as afterthoughts but as lifelines. Authorities began to recognize that the safety of the most vulnerable must outweigh convenience, cost, or tradition. And communities learned that remembrance itself is a form of responsibility, a way of ensuring that suffering is not repeated through forgetfulness. In this way, the voices silenced on a Sunderland staircase were not entirely lost. They became part of a lasting moral warning, whispered through memorials, regulations, and collective memory, ensuring that what happened at Victoria Hall would never again be dismissed as a mere accident, but remembered as a lesson carved into history by the lives of children who went out for joy and never came home.